Military history is filled with incidents that are classified, partially declassified, or permanently sealed from public access. Some events are explained through official reports, others remain buried under layers of secrecy, and a few continue to circulate in whispers because the truth behind them was never fully confirmed. Among these unresolved accounts is one of the most disturbing and unexplained stories ever associated with a Marine Expeditionary Force, MEF, operation. The sudden disappearance of hundreds of soldiers during a coordinated field exercise in a remote operational zone. Even today, official records remain limited, public statements are vague, and those who were indirectly involved often refuse to discuss it in detail, citing classification or operational sensitivity. But within the fragments of available information lies a story that has never stopped raising questions. A story about preparation, deployment, and then complete silence. The operation began under standard military procedure. A Marine Expeditionary Force unit was assigned to a large-scale readiness exercise designed to simulate extended field operations under controlled conditions. The objective was not combat, but evaluation, testing coordination between ground units, communication systems, logistical support, and command response under realistic pressure. The personnel involved were experienced soldiers, trained for complex missions, and familiar with unpredictable environments. This was not their first deployment exercise, nor was it considered unusual in scope. The selected region for the exercise was remote and strategically isolated. It provided difficult terrain, limited infrastructure, and environmental challenges that made it ideal for testing endurance, navigation, and communication reliability. From a planning perspective, everything appeared routine. The operation had been carefully mapped. Communication systems had been tested in advance. Emergency protocols were in place. Satellite tracking was active. Redundant communication layers were established. There was no initial indication that anything about this exercise would deviate from normal expectations. In the early phase of deployment, the operation proceeded exactly as planned. Units entered the designated zone according to schedule. Command structures were established without delay. Field positions were secured. Initial objectives were completed successfully. For a short period, everything appeared stable and fully operational. Communication between units and central command remained active, with regular status updates confirming movement, positioning, and environmental conditions. Nothing suggested instability. Nothing indicated risk. Then, without warning, the pattern began to change. At first, it was subtle. Minor delays appeared in communication responses. Messages that were normally acknowledged within seconds began taking longer to confirm. Some transmissions required repetition before confirmation was received. Initially, these irregularities were considered insignificant. In remote environments, signal delay is common due to terrain interference or atmospheric conditions. Command personnel did not immediately escalate concern. However, within a short period, the irregularities expanded. Communication delays became more frequent. Some transmissions arrived incomplete. Others were repeated automatically without acknowledgement from receiving units. The system began showing inconsistencies across multiple communication channels simultaneously. At this stage, the situation transitioned from routine monitoring to active observation. Command attempted to stabilize communication flow by switching to backup channels. Signal relays were adjusted. Alternative frequencies were activated. Satellite links were prioritized. But instead of improving, the situation worsened. Entire units began dropping off communication networks, not individually, but in clusters. Multiple squads stopped responding within overlapping timeframes. This pattern immediately raised concern at higher command levels, because in military operations, communication failure rarely occurs in synchronized groups unless influenced by a shared external factor. At this point, the exercise was no longer considered routine. Emergency monitoring protocols were activated. Aerial surveillance assets were redirected toward the affected region. Reconnaissance systems were placed on high alert. Command centers attempted to re-establish contact through all available channels, but the silence continued. What made the situation increasingly unusual was the absence of partial recovery signals. In typical communication failures, even degraded systems continue to send intermittent pings or emergency alerts. In this case, there was nothing. No partial transmissions, no distress signals, no location updates. Just complete silence. As the timeline progressed, surveillance data added another layer of confusion. Aerial monitoring showed no signs of active combat or large-scale environmental disruption in the affected zone. The terrain appeared unchanged. No explosions were recorded. No movement clusters were detected. No thermal signatures indicated large-scale engagement. From above, the region looked undisturbed. And yet, on the ground, hundreds of soldiers were no longer responding. Search and verification protocols were immediately initiated. Rapid response teams were deployed to confirm the status of the last known coordinates. These teams entered the zone, expecting either communication restoration or clear signs of what had occurred. What they found did not match expectations. The environment appeared operationally quiet, in a way that felt unusual for an active military exercise zone. There was no visible conflict, no active movement, no emergency activity. However, there were signs that personnel had been present recently. Footprints were visible in multiple locations. Temporary field positions had been established. Equipment was found in operational condition but abandoned. Some communication devices were still powered on, but inactive. It appeared as though activity had stopped abruptly rather than being gradually evacuated. The absence of structured withdrawal became one of the first major questions in the investigation. Military units do not simply disappear from coordinated operations without triggering multiple layers of emergency response. Yet in this case, those layers had not activated in any meaningful way. Command logs confirmed that no authorized extraction order had been issued, no emergency evacuation protocols had been initiated, no centralized command decision had been recorded instructing withdrawal or repositioning. According to all verified systems, the units had not been moved. They had simply stopped communicating. This contradiction became central to the investigation, because it meant one of two things. Either the communication systems had failed completely across all layers at the exact same moment, or something had interrupted the operational environment in a way that prevented all standard systems from functioning simultaneously. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline using available satellite data, communication logs, and operational tracking systems. What they discovered added more uncertainty. Up until a very specific moment, all units appeared fully operational. Then, within a narrow time window, communication activity dropped across multiple systems almost simultaneously, not gradually, not sporadically, but in a synchronized collapse. This level of uniformity is highly unusual in complex systems, where failures typically cascade unevenly rather than occurring in perfect alignment. As analysts reviewed the data, attention shifted to the final recorded positions of the missing units. Mapping systems confirmed that all affected personnel were operating within a defined geographical corridor at the time of disappearance. This corridor became the focus of intensive ground and aerial searches. Satellite images taken before the incident showed normal terrain conditions, no visible anomalies, no structural disturbances, no environmental irregularities. However, images taken after the communication blackout showed a strange absence of expected operational signatures. Areas that previously indicated active presence now appeared completely inactive. It was as if operational activity had been erased. This finding deepened the mystery further, because it suggested that whatever occurred did not leave behind a gradual transition or visible progression. Instead, it indicated an abrupt and total interruption. As recovery teams continued searching, they documented another unusual detail. While equipment and field markers were found, there were no clear indications of large-scale conflict, no destroyed infrastructure, no widespread damage, no signs of sustained engagement. This created a contradiction in the evidence. Hundreds of soldiers had been present, communication had been active, operations had been underway, and then everything had stopped, without explanation, without warning, without traceable cause. As the investigation progressed, analysts began to consider possibilities beyond standard operational failure scenarios. Electronic interference was examined, environmental factors were reviewed, technical malfunctions were analyzed, but each explanation encountered limitations when compared against the synchronized nature of the disappearance. No single known factor could account for a complete multi-system collapse across hundreds of personnel within such a narrow time frame. As a result, the case remained open and unresolved. And while official statements remained minimal, internal discussions continued to reference the incident as an anomalous operational disappearance, a term that explained nothing, but documented everything that could not be explained. And as investigators reached this point, one conclusion became unavoidable. What happened in that remote operational zone did not behave like a standard military incident. It behaved like something outside expected operational logic. And yet, the most important question still remained unanswered. Where did hundreds of trained soldiers go in the moments after communication was lost? Because at the point where records end, the mystery truly begins. After the initial phase of confusion and emergency response, the investigation into the disappearance of hundreds of MEF soldiers entered a far more complex and uncertain stage. What had begun as a communication failure during a controlled military exercise had now transformed into an unexplained operational anomaly with no clear precedent in modern military history. The most alarming aspect was not only the disappearance itself, but the complete absence of a conventional explanation. No confirmed engagement, no verified extraction, no documented casualty event, only silence, where hundreds of active personnel had once been operating under full command structure. As days passed, investigative teams intensified their efforts within the affected corridor. The priority was no longer just recovery, it was reconstruction. Reconstruction of what happened in the final minutes before the communication collapse. Initial assumptions continued to focus on technical failure. Military communication systems are complex and rely on multiple layers of redundancy. In theory, even if one system fails, others should continue functioning. However, in this case, all known communication channels had failed almost simultaneously. Field radios stopped responding. Satellite uplinks were interrupted. Tracking beacons ceased transmission. Backup systems also went silent. This pattern suggested something beyond isolated malfunction. It suggested a shared point of disruption affecting all systems at once. Investigators attempted to determine whether external interference could explain the event. Electronic warfare scenarios were reviewed in detail. In modern military operations, adversarial forces sometimes use jamming systems to disrupt communication networks. However, jamming typically degrades signals rather than eliminating them entirely across multiple independent systems simultaneously. Furthermore, no confirmed hostile presence was detected in the region at the time of the exercise. No unauthorized signals were recorded in available spectrum analysis data. No evidence of coordinated electronic attack was identified. This led analysts to explore environmental explanations. Certain natural phenomena, such as geomagnetic disturbances, solar flares, or atmospheric anomalies, can interfere with communication systems. But meteorological and space weather data from the period showed no significant events strong enough to cause such a complete breakdown. Ground conditions were also analyzed. No earthquakes, no volcanic activity. No extreme weather events were recorded in the operational zone during the time frame of the disappearance. With conventional explanations weakening, attention shifted toward field evidence collected during ground searches. Recovery teams reported a number of inconsistencies that added further complexity to the case. While the terrain showed signs of recent human activity, there was no indication of large-scale conflict. Footprints were present in multiple areas, suggesting organized movement prior to the disappearance. Temporary field positions had been established and partially dismantled. Equipment was found scattered in operational condition, but abandoned without clear signs of struggle. Some communication devices were still powered on, but frozen mid-operation, as if their processes had been abruptly halted. These findings created a critical contradiction. If hundreds of soldiers had been removed by force or engaged in combat, the environment would normally reflect that intensity. Damage, disruption, or residual evidence would be expected. Instead, the area appeared strangely intact, not untouched, but incomplete, as if an ongoing operation had simply stopped in the middle of execution. This observation became a focal point of internal debate. One theory suggested rapid extraction under controlled conditions. However, no extraction vehicles, airlift operations, or command-authorized evacuation procedures were recorded in official logs. Military protocol requires strict documentation for any large-scale movement of personnel, and no such authorization existed. Another theory considered coordinated fragmentation of units, where soldiers may have become dispersed due to navigation failure or environmental disorientation. But even in such scenarios, isolated communication signals or survival responses would typically persist. In this case, there were none. Everything had stopped at once. To better understand the sequence of events, analysts reconstructed the final operational timeline using all available data sources: satellite imagery, communication logs, tracking metadata, environmental monitoring systems. Up until a precise moment, all systems indicated normal operational behavior. Then, within a very narrow time window, activity dropped across multiple platforms simultaneously. Not gradually, not partially, but in a tightly synchronized collapse. This finding was particularly significant because system failures in complex environments rarely occur in perfect alignment unless influenced by a shared external trigger. Yet no such trigger was identified. As the investigation progressed, attention shifted to the exact location of the missing units at the moment communication ceased. Mapping data confirmed that all affected personnel were operating within a specific geographical corridor. This area became the primary focus of detailed aerial and ground surveys. Satellite images taken before the incident showed no unusual terrain features or anomalies, no visible structures, no environmental disturbances, no indications of hidden activity. However, images captured after the disappearance revealed something unusual, not what was present, but what was missing. Areas previously marked as active operational zones now showed no detectable movement signatures, no heat activity, no communication markers, no operational traces consistent with human presence. It was as if the activity footprint had simply been erased. This absence raised new questions about the nature of the event, because standard military incidents leave residual patterns. Even after evacuation or conflict, there are usually detectable traces of movement, disturbance, or aftermath. In this case, those expected patterns were minimal or absent. As field teams continued their search, they documented additional anomalies. Certain communication devices recovered from the area contained partial logs that ended abruptly. Some devices appeared to have stopped recording mid-process. Others showed corrupted data files that could not be reconstructed. Importantly, none of these devices contained a final distress message or coordinated emergency signal. This absence was considered highly unusual. In most critical scenarios, personnel activate emergency protocols before communication is completely lost. But in this case, no such final transmission existed. As the investigation deepened, internal analysis began to explore more unconventional possibilities. While no official conclusion supported these ideas, they emerged due to the inability of standard models to explain the observed data. One hypothesis considered the possibility of advanced experimental interference, systems or technologies not publicly acknowledged that could potentially disrupt communication, perception, or spatial tracking within a confined operational zone. Another speculative idea involved temporary environmental distortion that might affect both communication systems and navigational awareness simultaneously. Although no scientific evidence confirmed such phenomena, these theories were discussed in analytical circles as potential frameworks for understanding the synchronized failure. Despite these efforts, no model successfully accounted for all observed anomalies. As time passed, the case remained officially unresolved. Public statements continued to reference the incident only as a communication loss during training exercise. No additional details were released. Internally, however, the case remained open under classification review, flagged due to incomplete and inconsistent data. What made the situation even more unusual was the lack of closure. No confirmed recovery, no verified remains, no definitive explanation. Only fragments of operational evidence that pointed toward presence, but not outcome. As analysts reviewed the final phase of available data, one detail stood out above all others. Up until the moment of disappearance, systems were functioning normally. There were no gradual warnings, no cascading failures, no visible indicators of impending collapse. The transition from full operational status to complete silence occurred within an extremely short time frame, short enough to challenge conventional understanding of system degradation in complex environments. And that final moment became the central focus of all remaining analysis, because everything after it was missing, not partially, not fragmented, but entirely absent, leaving behind a single unresolved question that continues to define the entire incident. What caused hundreds of coordinated soldiers operating under structured command to vanish from an active system without leaving behind a traceable sequence of events? Even now, years later, the answer remains unknown, and the silence surrounding it continues to grow heavier with time. Because in the absence of evidence, speculation becomes inevitable, and in the absence of explanation, the mystery only deepens.